CHAPTER18. Grave questions. But the projectile had passed the enceinte of Tycho, and Barbicane and his two companions watched with scrupulous attention the brilliant rays which the celebrated mountain shed so curiously over the horizon. What was this radiant glory? What geological phenomenon had designed these ardent beams? This question occupied Barbicane's mind. Under his eyes ran in all directions luminous furrows, raised at the edges and concave in the center, some 12 miles, others 30 miles broad. These brilliant trains extended in some places to within 600 miles of Tycho, and seemed to cover, particularly toward the east, the northeast and the north, the half of the southern hemisphere. One of these jets extended as far as the Sickle of Neander, situated on the 40th meridian. Another, by a slight curve, furrowed the Sea of Nectar, breaking against the chain of Piraeus after a circuit of 800 miles. Others, toward the west, covered the Sea of Clouds and the Sea of Humors with a luminous network. What was the origin of these sparkling rays, which shone on the plains, as well as on the reliefs, at whatever height they might be? All started from a common center, the crater of Tycho. They sprang from him. Herschel attributed their brilliancy to currents of lava congealed by the cold. An opinion, however, which has not been generally adopted. Other astronomers have seen in these inexplicable rays a kind of moraines, rows of erratic blocks, which had been thrown up at the period of Tycho's formation. And why not? Asked Nicholl of Barbicane, who was relating and rejecting these different opinions. Because the regularity of these luminous lines, and the violence necessary to carry volcanic matter to such distances, is inexplicable. By Jove, replied Michel Ardan, it seems easy enough to me to explain the origin of these rays. Indeed, said Barbicane. Indeed, continued Michel, it is enough to say that it is a vast star, similar to that produced by a bull, or a stone thrown at a square of glass. Well, replied Barbicane, smiling, and what hand would be powerful enough to throw a bull to give such a shock as that? The hand is not necessary, answered Nicholl, not at all confounded. And as to the stone, let us suppose it to be a comet. Ah, those much abused comets, exclaimed Barbicane, my brave Michel, your explanation is not bad. But your comet is useless. The shock which produced that rent must have come from the inside of the star. A violent contraction of the lunar crust, while cooling, might suffice to imprint this gigantic star. A contraction, something like a lunar stomach ache, said Michel Ardan. Besides, added Barbicane, this opinion is that of an English savant, Nasmyth, and it seems to me to sufficiently explain the radiation of these mountains. That Nasmyth was no fool, replied Michel. Long did the travelers, whom such a sight could never weary, admire the splendors of Tycho, their projectile, saturated with luminous gleams, in the double irradiation of sun and moon, must have appeared like an incandescent globe. They had passed suddenly from excessive cold to intense heat. Nature was thus preparing them to become Selenites. That idea brought up once more the question of the habitability of the moon. After what they had seen, could the travelers solve it? Would they decide for or against it? Michel Ardan persuaded his two friends to form an opinion, and asked them directly if they thought that men and animals were represented in the lunar world. I think that we can answer, said Barbicane. But according to my idea, the question ought not to be put in that form. I ask it to be put differently. Put it your own way, replied Michel. Here it is, continued Barbicane. The problem is a double one, and requires a double solution. Is the moon habitable? Has the moon ever been inhabitable? Good, replied Nicole. First let us see whether the moon is habitable. To tell the truth, I know nothing about it, answered Michel. And I answer in the negative, continued Barbicane. In her actual state, with her surrounding atmosphere certainly very much reduced, her seas for the most part dried up, her insufficient supply of water restricted, vegetation, sudden alternations of cold and heat, her days and nights of 354 hours, the moon does not seem habitable to me, nor does she seem propitious to animal development, nor sufficient for the wants of existence, as we understand it. Agreed, replied Nicole, but is not the moon habitable for creatures differently organized from ourselves? That question is more difficult to answer, but I will try. And I asked Nicole if motion appears to him to be a necessary result of life, whatever be its organization. Without a doubt, answered Nicole. Then, my worthy companion, I would answer that we have observed the lunar continent at a distance of 500 yards at most, and that nothing seemed to us to move on the moon's surface. The presence of any kind of life would have been betrayed by its attendant marks, such as divers buildings, and even by ruins. And what have we seen? Everywhere and always the geological works of nature, never the work of man. If, then, there exist representatives of the animal kingdom on the moon, they must have fled to those unfathomable cavities, which the eye cannot reach, which I cannot admit, for they must have left traces of their passage on those plains, which the atmosphere must cover, however slightly raised it may be. These traces are nowhere visible. There remains but one hypothesis, that of a living race to which motion, which is life, is foreign. One might as well say, living creatures, which do not live, replied Michel. Just so, said Barbicane, which for us has no meaning. Then we may form our opinion, said Michel. Yes, replied Nicole. Very well, continued Michel. Arden, the scientific commission assembled in the projectile of the Gun Club after having founded their argument on facts recently observed, decide unanimously upon the question of the habitability of the moon. The moon is not habitable. This decision was consigned by President Barbicane to his notebook, where the process of the sitting of the 6th of December may be seen. Now, said Nicole, let us attack the second question, an indispensable complement of the first. I ask the Honorable Commission, if the moon is not habitable, has she ever been inhabited, Citizen Barbicane? My friends, replied Barbicane, I did not undertake this journey in order to form an opinion on the past habitability of our satellite. But I will add that our personal observations only confirm me in this opinion. I believe, indeed I affirm, that the moon has been inhabited by a human race organized like our own. That she has produced animals anatomically formed like the terrestrial animals, but I add that these races, human and animal, have had their day, and are now forever extinct. Then, asked Michel, the moon must be older than the earth. No, said Barbicane decidedly, but a world which has grown old quicker, and whose formation and deformation have been more rapid, relatively, the organizing force of matter has been much more violent in the interior of the moon than in the interior of the terrestrial globe. The actual state of this cracked, twisted, and burst disk abundantly proves this. The moon and the earth were nothing but gaseous masses originally. These gases have passed into a liquid state under different influences, and the solid masses have been formed later, but most certainly our sphere was still gaseous or liquid when the moon was solidified by cooling and had become habitable. I believe it, said Nicole. Then, continued Barbicane, an atmosphere surrounded it. The waters contained within this gaseous envelope could not evaporate under the influence of air, water, light, solar heat, and central heat. Vegetation took possession of the continents prepared to receive it, and certainly life showed itself about this period, for nature does not expend herself in vain. And a world so wonderfully formed for habitation must necessarily be inhabited. But, said Nicole, many phenomena inherent in our satellite might cramp the expansion of the animal and vegetable kingdom, for example, its days and nights of 354 hours. At the terrestrial poles, they last 6 months, said Michel. An argument of little value, since the poles are not inhabited. Let us observe, my friends, continued Barbicane, that if in the actual state of the moon, its long nights and long days created differences of temperature insupportable to organization, it was not so at the historical period of time. The atmosphere enveloped the disk with a fluid mantle. Vapor deposited itself in the shape of clouds. This natural screen tempered the ardor of the solar rays and retained the nocturnal radiation. Light, like heat, can diffuse itself in the air. Hence inequality between the influences, which no longer exists. Now that atmosphere has almost entirely disappeared, and now I am going to astonish you. Astonish us, said Michel Ardan. I firmly believe that at the period when the moon was inhabited, the nights and days did not last 354 hours. And why? Asked Nicole quickly. Because most probably then the rotary motion of the moon upon her axis was not equal to her revolution and equality, which presents each part of her disk during 15 days to the action of the solar rays. Granted, replied Nicole, but why should not these two motions have been equal, as they are really so? Because that equality has only been determined by terrestrial attraction, and who can say that this attraction was powerful enough to alter the motion of the moon at that period, when the earth was still fluid? Just so, replied Nicole, and who can say that the moon has always been a satellite of the earth? And who can say, exclaimed Michel Ardan, that the moon did not exist before the earth? Their imaginations carried them away into an indefinite field of hypothesis. Barbicane sought to restrain them. Those speculations are too high, said he. Problems utterly insoluble. Do not let us enter upon them. Let us only admit the insufficiency of the primordial attraction. And then by the inequality of the two motions of rotation and revolution, the days and nights could have succeeded each other on the moon, as they succeed each other on the earth. Besides, even without these conditions, life was possible. And so, asked Michel Ardan, humanity has disappeared from the moon. Yes, replied Barbicane, after having doubtless remained persistently for millions of centuries. By degrees the atmosphere becoming rarefied, the disk became uninhabitable, as the terrestrial globe will one day become by cooling. By cooling. Certainly, replied Barbicane, as the internal fires became extinguished, and the incandescent matter concentrated itself, the lunar crust cooled. By degrees the consequences of these phenomena showed themselves in the disappearance of organized beings, and by the disappearance of vegetation, Soon the atmosphere was rarefied, probably withdrawn by terrestrial attraction. Then aerial departure of respirable air, and disappearance of water by means of evaporation. At this period the moon, becoming uninhabitable, was no longer inhabited. It was a dead world, such as we see it today. And you say that the same fate is in store for the earth? Most probably. But when? When the cooling of its crust shall have made it uninhabitable? And have they calculated the time which our unfortunate sphere will take to cool? Certainly. And you know these calculations? Perfectly. But speak, then, my clumsy savant, exclaimed Michel Ardan, for you make me boil with impatience. Very well, my good Michel, replied Barbicane quietly. We know what diminution of temperature the Earth undergoes in the lapse of a century, and according to certain calculations, this mean temperature will, after a period of 400,000 years, be brought down to zero. 400,000 years, exclaimed Michel. Ah! I breathe again. Really, I was frightened to hear you. I imagined that we had not more than 50,000 years to live. Barbicane and Nicholl could not help laughing at their companion's uneasiness. Then, Nicholl, who wished to end the discussion, put the second question, which had just been considered again. Has the moon been inhabited? He asked. The answer was unanimously in the affirmative, but during this discussion, fruitful in somewhat hazardous theories, the projectile was rapidly leaving the moon. The lineaments faded away from the traveler's eyes, mountains were confused in the distance. And of all the wonderful, strange, and fantastical form of the Earth's satellite, there soon remained nothing but the imperishable remembrance. Chapter 19. A. Struggle against the impossible. For a long time Barbicane and his companions looked silently and sadly upon that world, which they had only seen from a distance, as Moses saw the land of Canaan, and which they were leaving without a possibility of ever returning to it. The projectile's position with regard to the moon had altered, and the base was now turned to the earth. This change, which Barbicane verified, did not fail to surprise them. If the projectile was to gravitate round the satellite in an elliptical orbit, why was not its heaviest part turned toward it, as the moon turns hers to the earth? That was a difficult point. In watching the course of the projectile, they could see that on leaving the moon, it followed a course analogous to that traced in approaching her. It was describing a very long ellipse, which would most likely extend to the point of equal attraction, where the influences of the Earth and its satellite are neutralized. Such was the conclusion, which Barbicane very justly drew from facts already observed, a conviction which his two friends shared with him. And when arrived at this dead point, what will become of us? Asked Michel Ardan. We don't know, replied Barbicane. But one can draw some hypotheses, I suppose. 2, answered Barbicane, either the projectile's speed will be insufficient, and it will remain forever immovable on this line of double attraction. I prefer the other hypothesis, whatever it may be, interrupted Michel. Or, continued Barbicane, its speed will be sufficient, and it will continue its elliptical course, to gravitate forever around the orb of night. A revolution not at all consoling, said Michel, to pass to the state of humble servants to a moon, whom we are accustomed to look upon as our own handmaid, so that is the fate in store for us. Neither Barbicane nor Nicholl answered. You do not answer, continued Michel impatiently. There is nothing to answer, said Nicole. Is there nothing to try? No, answered Barbicane. Do you pretend to fight against the impossible? Why not do one Frenchman and two Americans shrink from such a word? But what would you do? Subdue this motion, which is bearing us away? Subdue it? Yes, continued Michel, getting animated, or else alter it, and employ it to the accomplishment of our own ends. And how? That is your affair. If artillerymen are not masters of their projectile, they are not artillerymen. If the projectile is to command the gunner, we had better ram the gunner into the gun, my faith. Fine savants, who do not know what is to become of us after inducing me. Inducing you, cried Barbicane and Nicole. Inducing you? What do you mean by that? No recrimination, said Michel. I do not complain. The trip has pleased me, and the projectile agrees with me. But let us do all that is humanly possible to do the fall somewhere, even if only on the moon. We ask no better, my worthy Michel, replied Barbicane, but means fail us. We cannot alter the motion of the projectile. No, nor diminish its speed. No, not even by lightening it, as they lighten an overloaded vessel. What would you throw out, said Nicole. We have no ballast on board. And indeed it seems to me that, if lightened it would go much quicker. Slower, quicker. Neither slower nor quicker, said Barbicane, wishing to make his two friends agree. For we float is space, and must no longer consider specific weight. Very well, cried Michel Ardan in a decided voice. Then there remains but one thing to do. What is it? Asked Nicole. Breakfast, answered the cool, audacious Frenchman, who always brought up this solution at the most difficult juncture. In any case, if this operation had no influence on the projectile's course, it could at least be tried without inconvenience, and even with success from a stomachic point of view. Certainly Michel had none but good ideas. They breakfasted then at 2 in the morning. The hour mattered little. Michel served his usual repast, crowned by a glorious bottle drawn from his private cellar. If ideas did not crowd on their brains, we must despair of the Chambertin of 1853. The repast finished, observation began again. Around the projectile, at an invariable distance, were the objects which had been thrown out. Evidently, in its translatory motion round the moon, it had not passed through any atmosphere, for the specific weight of these different objects would have checked their relative speed. On the side of the terrestrial sphere nothing was to be seen. The earth was but a day old, having been new the night before at 12, and 2 days must elapse before its crescent, freed from the solar rays, would serve as a clock to the Selenites, as in its rotary movement each of its points, after 24 hours repasses the same lunar meridian. On the moon's side the sight was different. The orb shone in all her splendor amid innumerable constellations, whose purity could not be troubled by her rays. On the disk, the planes were already returning to the dark tint which is seen from the earth. The other part of the nimbus remained brilliant, and in the midst of this general brilliancy, Tycho shone prominently like a sun. Barbicane had no means of estimating the projectile's speed, but reasoning showed that it must uniformly decrease, according to the laws of mechanical reasoning. Having admitted that the projectile was describing an orbit around the moon, this orbit must necessarily be elliptical. Science proves that it must be so. no motive body circulating round, an attracting body fails in this law. Every orbit described in space is elliptical, and why should the projectile of the gun club escape this natural arrangement? In elliptical orbits, the attracting body always occupies one of the foci, so that at one moment the satellite is nearer, and at another farther from the orb around which it gravitates. When the Earth is nearest the Sun, she is in her perihelia, and in her aphelion at the farthest point. Speaking of the Moon, she is nearest to the Earth in her perigee, and farthest from it in her apogee, to use analogous expressions, with which the astronomer's language is enriched. If the projectile remains as a satellite of the Moon, we must say that it is in its aposelene at its farthest point, and in its periselene at its nearest. In the latter case, the projectile would attain its maximum of speed, and in the former its minimum. It was evidently moving toward its aposelenitical point, and Barbicane had reason to think that its speed would decrease up to this point, and then increase by degrees as it neared the Moon. This speed would even become nil if this point joined that of equal attraction. Barbicane studied the consequences of these different situations, and thinking what inference he could draw from them, when he was roughly disturbed by a cry from Michel Ardan. "By Jove!" he exclaimed, "I must admit we are downright simpletons." "I do not say we are not," replied Barbicane. "But why?" "Because we have a very simple means of checking this speed, which is bearing us from the Moon, and we do not use it." "And what is the means?" "To use the recoil contained in our rockets." "Done," said Nicholl. "We have not used this force yet," said Barbicane. "It is true, but we will do so." "When?" asked Michel. "When the time comes. Observe, my friends, that in the position occupied by the projectile, an oblique position with regard to the lunar disk, our rockets, in slightly altering its direction, might turn it from the Moon instead of drawing it nearer." "Just so," replied Michel. "Let us wait, then. By some inexplicable influence, the projectile is turning its base toward the Earth. It is probable that at the point of equal attraction, its conical cap will be directed rigidly toward the Moon. At that moment, we may hope that its speed will be nil. Then will be the moment to act, and with the influence of our rockets, we may perhaps provoke a fall directly on the surface of the lunar disk." "Bravo," said Michel. "What we did not do, what we could not do on our first passage at the dead point, because the projectile was then endowed with too great a speed." "Very well reasoned," said Nicholl. "Let us wait patiently," continued Barbicane, "putting every chance on our side, and after having so much despaired, I may say I think we shall gain our end." This conclusion was a signal for Michel Ardan's hips and hurrahs, and none of the audacious boobies remembered the question that they themselves had solved in the negative. No, the Moon is not inhabited. No, the Moon is probably not habitable, and yet they were going to try everything to reach her. One single question remained to be solved: at what precise moment the projectile would reach the point of equal attraction, on which the travelers must play their last card. In order to calculate this to within a few seconds, Barbicane had only to refer to his notes, and to reckon the different heights taken on the lunar parallels. Thus the time necessary to travel over the distance between the dead point and the South Pole would be equal to the distance separating the North Pole from the dead point. The hours representing the time traveled over were carefully noted, and the calculation was easy. Barbicane found that this point would be reached at 1 in the morning, on the night of the 7th-8th of December. so that, if nothing interfered with its course, it would reach the given point in 22 hours. The rockets had primarily been placed to check the fall of the projectile upon the moon, and now they were going to employ them for a directly contrary purpose. In any case, they were ready, and they had only to wait for the moment to set fire to them. "Since there is nothing else to be done," said Nicole, "I make a proposition." "What is it?" asked Barbicane. "I propose to go to sleep." "What a motion!" exclaimed Michel Ardan. "It is 40 hours since we closed our eyes," said Nicole. "Some hours of sleep will restore our strength." "Never," interrupted Michel. "Well," continued Nicole, "every one to his taste. I shall go to sleep," and stretching himself on the divan, he soon snored like a 48-pounder. "That Nicole has a good deal of sense," said Barbicane. "Presently I shall follow his example." Some moments after, his continued bass supported the captain's baritone. "Certainly," said Michel Ardan, finding himself alone, "these practical people have sometimes most opportune ideas." And with his long legs stretched out, and his great arms folded under his head, Michel slept in his turn. But this sleep could be neither peaceful nor lasting. The minds of these three men were too much occupied, and some hours after, about 7 in the morning, all three were on foot at the same instant. The projectile was still leaving the moon, and turning its conical part more and more toward her. An inexplicable phenomenon, but one which happily served Barbicane's ends. 17 hours more, and the moment for action would have arrived. The day seemed long. However bold the travelers might be, they were greatly impressed by the approach of that moment, which would decide either precipitate their fall onto the moon, or forever chain them in an immutable orbit. They counted the hours as they passed to slow for their wish. Barbicane and Nicole were obstinately plunged in their calculations, Michel going and coming between the narrow walls, and watching that impassive moon with a longing eye. At times recollections of the earth crossed their minds. They saw once more their friends of the gun club, and the dearest of all, J.T. Maston. At that moment, the Honorable Secretary must be filling his post on the Rocky Mountains. If he could see the projectile through the glass of his gigantic telescope, what would he think? After seeing it disappear behind the moon's south pole, he would see them reappear by the North Pole. They must therefore be a satellite of a satellite. Had J.T. Maston given this unexpected news to the world? Was this the denouement of this great enterprise? But the day passed without incident. The terrestrial midnight arrived. The 8th of December was beginning. 1 hour more, and the point of equal attraction would be reached. What speed would then animate the projectile? They could not estimate it, but no error could vitiate Barbicane's calculations. At 1 in the morning, this speed ought to be, and would be, nil. Besides, another phenomenon would mark the projectile's stopping point on the neutral line. At that spot the two attractions, lunar and terrestrial, would be annulled. Objects would weigh no more. This singular fact, which had surprised Barbicane and his companions so much in going, would be repeated on their return under the very same conditions. At this precise moment they must act. Already the projectile's conical top was sensibly turned toward the lunar disk, presented in such a way as to utilize the whole of the recoil produced by the pressure of the rocket apparatus. The chances were in favor of the travelers. If its speed was utterly annulled on this dead point, a decided movement toward the moon would suffice, however slight, to determine its fall. 5 minutes to 1, said Nicole. All is ready, replied Michel Ardan, directing a lighted match to the flame of the gas. "Wait," said Barbicane, holding his chronometer in his hand. At that moment weight had no effect. The travelers felt in themselves the entire disappearance of it. They were very near the neutral point if they did not touch it. 1 o'clock, said Barbicane. Michel Ardan applied the lighted match to a train in communication with the rockets. No detonation was heard in the inside, for there was no air, but through the scuttles, Barbicane saw a prolonged smoke, the flames of which were immediately extinguished. The projectile sustained a certain shock, which was sensibly felt in the interior. The three friends looked and listened without speaking, and scarcely breathing. One might have heard the beating of their hearts amid this perfect silence. "Are we falling?" asked Michel Ardan at length. "No," said Nicole, "since the bottom of the projectile is not turning to the lunar disk." At this moment, Barbicane, quitting his scuttle, turned to his two companions. He was frightfully pale, his forehead wrinkled, and his lips contracted. "We are falling," said he. "Well," cried Michel Ardan, "onto the moon." "Onto the earth." "The devil!" exclaimed Michel Ardan, adding philosophically, "Well, when we came into this projectile, we were very doubtful as to the ease with which we should get out of it. And now this fearful fall had begun. The speed retained had borne the projectile. Beyond the dead point, the explosion of the rockets could not divert its course. This speed in going had carried it over the neutral line, and in returning had done the same thing. The laws of physics condemned it to pass through every point which it had already gone through. It was a terrible fall, from a height of 160,000 miles, and no springs to break it. According to the laws of gunnery, the projectile must strike the earth with a speed equal to that with which it left the mouth of the Columbia at a speed of 16,000 yards in the last second. But to give some figures of comparison, it has been reckoned that an object thrown from the top of the towers of Notre Dame, the height of which is only 200 feet, will arrive on the pavement at a speed of 240 miles per hour. Here the projectile must strike the earth with a speed of 115,200 miles per hour. "We are lost," said Michel coolly. "Very well, if we die," answered Barbicane, with a sort of religious enthusiasm. "The results of our travels will be magnificently spread. It is his own secret that God will tell us. In the other life the soul will want to know nothing, either of machines or engines. It will be identified with eternal wisdom." "In fact," interrupted Michel Ardan, "the whole of the other world may well console us for the loss of that inferior orb called the moon." Barbicane crossed his arms on his breast with a motion of sublime resignation, saying at the same time, "The will of heaven be done." Chapter 20. The soundings of the Susquehanna A. "Well, Lieutenant, and our soundings?" "I think, sir, that the operation is nearing its completion," replied Lieutenant Bronsfield, "but who would have thought of finding such a depth, so near in shore, and only 200 miles from the American coast?" "Certainly, Bronsfield, there is a great depression," said Captain Blomsberry. "In this spot there is a submarine valley worn by Humboldt's current, which skirts the coast of America as far as the Straits of Magellan. These great depths," continued the lieutenant, "are not favorable for laying telegraphic cables. A level bottom, like that supporting the American cable between Valencia and Newfoundland, is much better." I agree with you, Bronsfield. With your permission, Lieutenant, where are we now? Sir, at this moment, we have 3,508 fathoms of line out, and the ball which draws the sounding lead has not yet touched the bottom. For if so, it would have come up of itself. Brooke's apparatus is very ingenious, said Captain Blomsberry. It gives us very exact soundings. Touch, cried at this moment one of the men at the forewheel, who was superintending the operation. The captain and the lieutenant mounted the quarterdeck. What depth have we? Asked the captain. 3,627 fathoms, replied the lieutenant, entering it in his notebook. Well, Bronsfield, said the captain, I will take down the result, now haul in the sounding line. It will be the work of some hours. In that time the engineer can light the furnaces, and we shall be ready to start as soon as you have finished. It is 10 o'clock, and with your permission, Lieutenant, I will turn in. Do so, sir, do so, replied the lieutenant obligingly. The captain of the Susquehanna, as brave a man as need be, and the humble servant of his officers, returned to his cabin, took a brandy grog, which and for the steward no end of praise, and turned in, not without having complimented his servant upon his making beds, and slept a peaceful sleep. It was then 10 at night. The 11th day of the month of December was drawing to a close in a magnificent night. The Susquehanna, a corvette of 500 horsepower of the United States Navy, was occupied in taking soundings in the Pacific Ocean about 200 miles off the American coast, following that long peninsula which stretches down the coast of Mexico. The wind had dropped by degrees. There was no disturbance in the air. The pennant hung motionless from the maintop gallant mast truck. Captain Jonathan Blomsberry, cousin German of Colonel Blomsberry, one of the most ardent supporters of the gun club, who had married an aunt of the captain, and daughter of an honorable Kentucky merchant, Captain Blomsberry could not have wished for finer weather in which to bring to a close his delicate operations of sounding. His corvette had not even felt the great tempests which, by sweeping away the groups of clouds on the Rocky Mountains, had allowed them to observe the course of the famous projectile. Everything went well, and with all the fervor of a Presbyterian, he did not forget to thank heaven for it. The series of soundings taken by the Susquehanna had for its aim the finding of a favorable spot for the laying of a submarine cable to connect the Hawaiian Islands with the coast of America. It was a great undertaking, due to the instigation of a powerful company. Its managing director, the intelligent Cyrus Field, proposed even covering all the islands of Oceanica with a vast electrical network, an immense enterprise, and one worthy of American genius.